Feminism has evolved greatly since its beginnings in the mid-19th century, expanding over many decades and having powerful effects on society and government. Could you imagine living in a world where your mother, sister, or even yourself were not afforded basic human rights, such as the right to vote or to work with equal pay? Without feminism throughout history, half of our population today, including many of you, would not have countless human rights. I've done extensive research into the history of feminism as well as an essay I wrote in high school about the road to modern feminism. Feminism throughout history has been classified into three major waves. We are now going to talk about the first wave of feminism. The first recorded movement of feminism is known as first wave feminism. This was not the beginning of women's fight for equality, but just the first organized movement. The first wave of feminism took place in the late 19th to early 20th century, and its primary focus was on women's suffrage, rights as full citizens, and the ability to work. Up to this point, women had been denied their civil rights, and this moment was about changing that. The start of the first wave was at the 1841 Seneca Falls Convention, where 300 women, along with men, rallied in support of equal rights for women. Women were seen doing things considered inconceivable, such as public speaking, demonstrations, and even doing time in jail. Doing all these things to fight for their rights was an immense challenge to a woman's understood domestic role. First wave feminists, or suffragettes, started their fight by rallying for their rights, and eventually they began making progress. In 1833, the first co-educational university was established. Women were now able to receive higher education, and eventually they would be able to use it to start careers. In 1841, the first women's rights movement took place in New York. In 1851, at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, Sojourner Truth brought race to the women's rights movement with her famous Ain't I a Woman speech. In 1896, Ida B. Wells, a freed slave, founded the National Association of Colored Women. In 1913, the women's movement became officially desegregated after women of all ethnicities marched on Washington for women's suffrage. In 1916, Margaret Sanger was arrested after opening the first birth control clinic in the United States. The women of the first wave of the first wave of the feminist movement had fought a long fight of protests, marches, and arrests. Their efforts paid off greatly. The movement had resulted in a number of new institutions for women and great social progression. But it wasn't until 1913 that the centerpiece of the women's rights movement was ratified. On August 18, 1913, the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, granting women the right to vote. Just a year later, Margaret Sanger, who was earlier arrested for her efforts, formed the American Birth Control League, later known as Planned Parenthood. Although these feminists had been granted their main goal of suffrage, it did not come without a great deal of resentment from the men of society. Now we will be talking about the second wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism, also known as the Women's Liberation Movement, was a movement that took place from the early 1960s to the early 1980s. This wave was different from the first wave in that it brought more women of different races and sexualities into the fight for equality. This wave was considered much more radical, considering that it brought up issues such as sexuality and reproductive rights. At this time, although progress had been made from the first wave, women were still limited in almost every aspect of their lives. Society still wanted the American woman to follow one path: get married in her early 20s, have children, and dedicate her life to homemaking. Women were taught that their main purpose in life was to take care of their husband, their children, and their home. This way of life left no time for a woman to pursue a career, and even if she did, her options were limited. The 38% of American women who were working in the 1960s were limited to jobs such as teachers, nurses, or secretaries. These jobs were not the only ones women could legally take, but they were largely unwelcomed in professions led by men at the time. Because of this blatant discrimination, American women in 1960 made up just 6% of doctors, 3% of lawyers, and less than 1% of engineers. Women of the time had no legal rights to the property or earnings of their husbands, but their husbands had complete control over their property and earnings. Women were still financially and legally controlled by their husbands, The second wave of feminism had an initial goal to dismantle workplace inequality. Women were denied access to better jobs, and they were discriminated against in the workplace. In 1964, Virginia Representative Howard Smith proposed adding a prohibition of gender inequality into the Civil Rights Act. All his fellow congressmen laughed and dismissed his efforts, but with the leadership of Martha Griffiths, a representative of Michigan, the law passed. It was quickly made clear that the law's protection of women workers was not being enforced. As a result, the group of feminists founded an organization with the intent of fighting gender discrimination. The group launched the National Organization for Women in the summer of 1966. The organization battled workplace discrimination in courts and fought to establish pro-equality laws. This generation of feminists sought to open opportunities for women in society on a public and political level. Later in this movement, feminists brought the fight for equality to a personal level. These more radical feminists wanted to make it clear that women's personal inequalities were just as important as the political. They focused on issues such as relationships, sexuality, birth control, abortion, clothing, body image, and roles in marriage. These women strived to make several things clear regarding women and their personal lives, including the idea that a woman's primary role was not only in the domestic environment. This wave of feminists also began to focus on the concept that what a woman does with her body is her own choice, which greatly influenced the efforts of the third wave of feminism. Now I will tell you about the third wave of feminism. The third wave of feminism began in the 1990s and is continuing today. Unlike the first two waves, people today are more receptive to the feminist message because of society's postmodern thinking. The past two waves of feminism have been focused on solidifying the civil rights of women and passing laws to protect them from discrimination. Because of this platform that the foremothers of feminism have provided for feminists today, this wave has been less about legalities and more about changing the perception of women in society. The first and second waves provided long-established feminist organizations as a tool for the third wave. They provided women with a strong foothold in society, and women of the third wave are continuing to strengthen it. The focus of the third wave is to make it clear that women are smart, capable, strong, and powerful. They strive to make it clear that women are in control of their own lives, with or without a male figure involved. This wave has been the most inclusive yet regarding people of all races, sexualities, and gender identifications. The third wave has changed modern society's view of what it means to be a woman. Women are no longer widely considered to only be useful in a domestic environment. Thanks to modern feminism, women are now more than ever free to be empowered. Third wave feminists have not shielded away from challenging modern standards of beauty and the objectification of women. They have challenged the concept that there is one certain way a woman should look and opposed the idea that a woman's worth lies within her physical attractiveness. It is clear, and even celebrated in today's society, that women come in all shapes and sizes, and that can be greatly attributed to modern-day feminism. Modern-day feminists are not afraid of taking on controversial issues, including the use of derogatory words used toward women. Feminists today challenge the people who scold women for acting in the same manner that men are praised for, considering this as an example of blatant sexism. Third wave feminists have made great progress in providing an environment for women and girls to celebrate themselves and to know their worth. Third wave feminists take a strong stance on the idea that what a woman does with her body is her own decision. As stated previously, this is largely due to the efforts made by second wave feminists regarding women's reproductive rights. They challenge the fact that many decisions made about a woman's reproductive rights are decided by men. Although the fight for reproductive rights has been a main focus of the feminist movement since the end of the first wave, the third wave has gained the most support and acknowledgement for women's reproductive rights, including the right to abortion, safe contraceptives, and better policies to address sexual violence. Feminism has been historically defined in three waves, all which progress the rights and equality of women. The first wave was focused on the right to vote, the second on liberation and workplace equality, and the third on women's empowerment and societal equality. Feminism has greatly evolved since its beginnings in the mid-19th century, expanding over many decades and having powerful effects on society and government. It has a huge historical significance in the United States that has and will continue to affect all of our lives.